Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner, and it is time now for the Crossroads interview. And for it, I am so pleased to welcome back to the show to talk about, do brown lives matter? To talk about Kamala Harris, Vice President, and the southern border. To talk about whether or not Joe Biden's going to allow the number of refugees he had promised into this country. Let's dive into these topics and more with syndicated columnist Ruben Navarrette, who is now the host of a brand new podcast available on all your podcast apps, Ruben in the Center. Ruben, my friend, welcome back.
Great to be back with you, Jimmy. Thanks.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
I want to jump right in because you asked a provocative question in a very recent column. You asked the question, and this is in the context of the death of Adam Toledo, who was shot and killed in Chicago by a police officer. You asked the question, do brown lives matter? And I was very struck by this because recently I was listening to my friend Rashini Rajkumar, who's a radio host in Minneapolis, and she is Sri Lankan, I believe, and she was talking about what was going on with the Derek Chauvin verdict because she's right there in Minneapolis, and she said she felt caught in the middle between black and white, being brown. And that came to mind as I was reading your piece. Tell us your thoughts.
Right. So another group that this falls into that middle ground, neither black nor white, are Asian Americans. You know, the new census numbers are going to come out. They're going to put Asian Americans at almost 10% of the population overall. And yet you saw after the Atlanta killings that America struggles with this paradigm of black and white, and it finds it very difficult when someone comes along as a victimized group that is neither black nor white. And Asian Americans experience that, and Latinos experience that. The same census is going to show that 20% of the country is Latino, and yet in this moment, at this moment, Hispanics are sort of lost and invisible because, again, the country, the media, the politics is all defined as black and white. So my answer to my own question is that no, brown lives don't matter because you have cases of police brutality, of people dying at the hands of police, going back in cities like Albuquerque and Las Vegas and Phoenix and Los Angeles for generations, and they've never gotten this kind of attention. So I think one thing in the media that we don't do very well is complexity. We like things simple, Jimmy. And I think that a paradigm that goes beyond black and white, whether you're talking about people from Sri Lanka or people who are Asian American or people who are Latino, it just doesn't fit into that paradigm.
Now, Ruben Navarrette, when you look at the dynamics of the Black Lives Matter movement, that's explicitly focusing on the idea that the black community has a particular grievance and needs to be addressed directly. So isn't it sort of exclusive by nature in terms of where they're trying to put the focus? And what do you make of that emphasis, especially over the past year?
So to take your question, I don't really think that the emphasis is so much about atoning for slavery, for instance. You know, I would say that Latinos experienced obviously a form of Jim Crow in the Southwest during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. You know, restaurants that said no dogs or Mexicans allowed. It all depends on where you're telling the story from. If you're telling it from New York or DC, you might not know that history, but it's kind of hard to miss out in the Southwest. But having said that, this is really about a very legitimate claim by African Americans that they seem to be singled out and picked on by police officers in this country. Now, obviously, in the vast majority of cases, the interactions with police do not result in any sort of harm to African Americans. But there have been significant numbers of African American, particularly African American men, who perhaps because they seem threatening to police or because police are judging them unfairly, do end up in the headlines in the most awful way. So that is a very legitimate point. I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on Black lives. We should focus on all lives, though, and we should be attuned to this idea that somehow, in the case of Adam Toledo, here you have a 13-year-old Mexican-American boy who's shot by a Chicago police officer after he does what he's told, which is stop and put your hands up. And so you would think that would get more press, but it really hasn't. You know, I consume a lot of media, and the media is much more comfortable reverting back to what it knows, which is black and white.
How do you think if at all, the immigration dynamic comes into play in what you're talking about, Ruben Navarrette?
Well, I think in some cases, there are people who think that the number that I throw out, 60 million Latinos in the country, 20% of the country, they say, oh, well, that's just a bunch of illegal immigrants. No, those people tend not to participate in census surveys. Those are the people who answer the door at the, when there's a knock at the door. Okay. Those are the people who participate in the census. The actual number of Hispanics in this country is probably much bigger. So I think there is a tendency sometimes to think that because illegal immigrants are by their very nature marginalized, that somehow many Hispanics are going to be marginalized. That's not the case. There are Mexican Americans who've lived in Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico, for hundreds of years in many cases. And so that is an important point that needs to be made. I just think a lot of it, Jimmy, goes back to geography. Your worldview is impacted by the fact that you live in Denver, Colorado. My worldview is I'm in San Diego. But if you and I did what we did in Washington or New York, we'd be stuck in that same black and white bubble.
Yeah, there is something so interesting about being outside of the Beltway and outside of New York City or outside of some of these centers where they're talking about these things in a very specific and narrow sort of way. And here you and I are in Denver, Colorado, and San Diego, California, with a different perspective, especially because you've lived in a few different places out west, Ruben Navarrette. Now, with that in mind, I want to ask you about the Derek Chauvin verdict. Of course, he was found guilty on all three counts against him. What did you make of that verdict, and also the reaction to it from people on different sides of the political spectrum?
Yeah, so I'm not just the grandson of a Mexican immigrant who came to the country legally during the Mexican Revolution. I'm also the son of a cop. My dad was on the job for 37 years, grew up around cops, and nothing hurts a good cop like a bad cop. I think most cops, if they're honest, will tell you that Derek Chauvin got what he deserved, that there's no excuse for keeping your knee on a man's neck after he's passed out, when his hands are, handcuffed behind him. It's not just to say the optics were bad. There are many things that Derek Chauvin did wrong, and he was held accountable for this. That's not the issue. What bothers me about this verdict is that it's become sort of a win-loss issue for African Americans. They have clearly lost so much in the context of the criminal justice system. Police, prosecutors, and judges who have for generations treated African Americans unfairly, convicted them when they were innocent, not convicted the people who assaulted or killed them when they were guilty. And so those are all losses. And now I think there's a tendency among African Americans to chalk this up as a win. The Derek Chauvin victory is a win. I literally heard last week, Jimmy, an African American woman tell a reporter at NPR that the verdict made her proud to be Black. Okay? It took me a while to figure that out. I'm still wrapping my head around it. How does a verdict in a criminal trial make you proud to be Black? And it's because many are treating this as a victory. That's not how you should view a matter of criminal justice is.
That's a point that I think is so important. What is criminal justice? Because we also heard Keith Ellison, who is the Attorney General for Minnesota, say that this isn't justice. Justice doesn't come until we have, I think it was restoration was the word that he used, amplifying this idea of justice to be more than a case-by-case basis, which is how I've always understood primarily justice to be, certainly from our legal system standpoint here in the United States, Ruben Navarrette.
Yeah, it extends to what they call social justice, this idea that it's intangible. You can't really define when it's ever going to end. I think that Ellison was right to call it accountability. I'm all about accountability. On the days that they say, hey, Ruben, you're a Republican, on the days that Latinos call me a Republican or dismiss me as a Republican, it's because I believe in accountability. I don't believe in making excuses. When you do something wrong, you get punished, okay? And whether you be a young Latino kid who does something wrong and he gets punished, or in this case, a middle-aged white cop, you get punished too. So I'm all pro accountability. And I think that's why this was a just verdict.
So justice achieved in that regard.
In one regard, yeah. They're talking about a more social justice, sweeping justice. Right. Where do you start with that? I mean, we're never going to be able to make up for the injustice of the past, right? So I understand Ellison's point in the overall, but with this particular case and this trial, this is a lot better outcome than had he been exonerated on all charges.
We could certainly also go over the verdict and your stance on that, but I want to jump in, since we only have a little bit longer with you, syndicated columnist Ruben Navarrette, again, host of the new podcast, Ruben in the Center. I want to talk about immigration, and especially Kamala Harris,
Yep.
the vice president who's been tapped by President Biden as he was tapped under former President Barack Obama to really oversee the immigration effort, what's happening at the border, be more hands-on in that regard. She was on CNN yesterday, in fact, to in part talk about her leadership position or whatever that is on the border. I didn't really gain much from that interview. That's why I don't really want to play any clip. We got some B-roll, but I don't think there's any really standout clip. What do you make of where Kamala Harris is at the border right? Oh, wait, she's not at the border.
She's not at the border. You know, in the Derek Chauvin verdict, when it came down, Kamala Harris was front and center. She cares about criminal justice. She cares about social justice. She cares about African Americans. She doesn't care about immigration, and she doesn't really care about Latinos. I speak now as a Californian who once had her as my senator. Even when she was in the Senate, a border state for California, she never cared about immigration, never proposed any legislation on immigration. It's not her thing. It's not her issue. She doesn't care, not interested. And so then when Joe Biden basically appointed her in this thankless position of being not his border czar, I won't say that. He put her in charge of the overall crisis. It's very difficult to deal with the migration crisis if you don't visit the border. And here we are, where Kamala Harris has stubbornly refused to go to the border. Instead, the spin out of the White House is, well, she's going to go over the border. She's going to go to Guatemala. She's going to go to Mexico, the root causes, etc. She can walk and chew gum at the same time. The reason, Jimmy, she doesn't want to go to the border is very simple. She doesn't want to be caught in a photo op standing in front of kids in cages, kids in these glass cylinders, these large aquariums without water, and have that come back to haunt her. She also doesn't want to be having to deal with questions that are impossible to answer, like what's your solution to this crisis? So of course she's going to see the border from 50,000 feet, and the media is going along with it, and they're giving her a pass on it, but they ought not. She's been a failure on the border. Joe Biden is failing on the border. His new polling shows that 2/3 of Americans think he's terrible on the border. 3/4 of Americans actually think he's terrible on the border, and only a fourth of Americans think he's doing okay on the border. So he's failing immigration, and Kamala Harris is part of that failure.
Well, and Ruben, and I know you're not a solutions guy in the sense that you say journalists shouldn't be offering solutions, but Kamala Harris as vice president or Joe Biden as president should be offering solutions. So what do you look for them to present? What are you looking from them, from them, in order to give you a sense that, you know what, they might actually be finally getting this situation?
Yeah, I'll give you one quick answer to that question. The reason I think journalists, and I really feel strongly about this, journalists should not be dragged into the solution game. Because if you become like a certain columnist at the New York Times, an expert on climate change, and you have your own proposal on climate change, it's going to be very difficult for you to have an open mind when the time comes to assess somebody else's competing position, because you've got a dog in that race. Journalists ought not have a dog in that race. And that's the main best argument for not having solutions. It's not that we don't have ideas and we know what we think the solutions should be, but it's very, very hard to be objective if you're on one side or the other. In terms of one positive solution, Jimmy, I'll give you this. George W. Bush, to his credit, probably the most pro-immigration president we've ever had in this country, has been making the rounds talking about immigration and a new book he has out on immigrants. And he was asked this question, and he said, look, what you need to do is get more immigration judges down to the border. There are a whole bunch of immigration judges. You need to appoint more of them, get them down to the border so they can adjudicate these cases in real time, and you can decide who gets to stay and who gets to go. That's it, man. That's the best answer I've heard. It's on my list as well. It was my answer as well. Listen to Bush.
Very interesting. Ruben Navarrette, final question for you. You're also critical of President Biden and his flip maybe on refugees that he would allow into this country. What's going on there from your standpoint?
It's crazy, right? So Donald Trump, in his last year of the pandemic, he put a cap of 15,000 refugees. Joe Biden did what Joe Biden does and what Democrats do. They go and promise to Latinos and others the moon and the stars. He says, you elect me, I'm going to raise that pathetically low 15,000 per year allotment for refugees up to 125,000 or more. But when he gets in office, 100 days into office, he says, you know what, I kind of like that Trump number. I think we're going to keep it there. Then AOC and others fall back and attack him for that and say, oh, not only are you flip-flopping, but are you taking your cues from Donald Trump on immigration and refugees? Then he flip-flops again and says, okay, tell you what, in May, I'll come back with some numbers, and I promise they'll be much higher. So this was an example, Jimmy, of how difficult it is for Joe Biden to hold together a fractured Democrat coalition that has different views on immigration. A white Rust Belt Democrat in Ohio sees this issue differently than AOC does in New York. And he's trying to piece it all together, Joe Biden is, and it's very difficult. And on the refugee issue and the cap issue, it exploded in his face.
30 seconds, Ruben Navarrette. I know we got to let you go. Ruben in the Center, your new podcast available on all podcast apps. My friend, what can people expect from the new show?
Yeah, it's beyond blue and red. It's not blue and red. It's not even strictly purple. It's just taking a look critically at all these issues and looking for the third way. We can't be forced and bullied into thinking the answer is on the hard right or the hard left. It's not. Oftentimes, it's in the middle of the road, what I call the sensible center. That's where I am, and that's why the podcast is Ruben in the Center.
Ruben Navarrette, everybody. Again, syndicated columnist. Check out his podcast, available on all the apps now. Ruben in the Center. Thanks so much for joining us, my friend.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Once again, syndicated columnist Ruben Navarrette, host of the podcast Ruben in the Center, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. I just wanted to get Ruben's unique viewpoint on some of the issues of the day, see where he's at, get his pulse a little bit. He's always got some very interesting thoughts to share on a variety of topics. And on immigration, he is critical of both the left and the right, I think with good reason in a lot of areas, but make no mistake about it. We have a crisis at the southern border when it comes to the massive influx of illegal immigrants, including unaccompanied minors. And that's especially, make no mistake, it's especially because they know that Joe Biden has said, basically inviting them to the country to come to the United States. He's basically invited illegal immigrant flows into the United States from his rhetoric and his unwillingness to seriously address the crisis at the border. And then he flips, I think, on the number of refugees he wants to allow into the country. And then there's no consistency there. If you don't have consistency, what do you have? And then he appoints Vice President Kamala Harris to be the point person on the border crisis. And as Ruben said, being a California resident himself, Kamala Harris has never really cared about immigration. She's never really paid attention to this issue or taken it seriously. She doesn't know what to do there and is not addressing it in a very cogent and coherent way. And that's what we need when you have a crisis like the one we have at the southern border with such a massive magnitude. We'll continue to keep tabs on this from various angles when it comes to the crisis at the southern border. But we need to run to a break.
Talking politics, great for generations. Oh, what a mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.